Here's how Trump can save America's auto industry and the planet, if you will. He's got to end the regulatory stronghold that exists for car companies. So, for instance, California is attempting to regulate, I just read the story, the fuel economy and emissions independent from the federal government standards. That has to stop. And hopefully the new head of the EPA will do that, and they should pass, the Congress should pass legislation. By the way, hat tip to the Federalists for this. Should pass legislation prohibiting a state from dictating its own fuel economy standards, especially a state like California. I mean, imagine if they were to, these big states were able to dictate who wins the presidency. That's why we have the Electoral College. The same applies here, in a sense. It impacts the sales of the entire nation. California's current policy is absolutely unreasonable, so the regulations have to end. You have to start with these CAFE standards. So currently, the automakers have a double-edged sword, a no-win choice, if you will. They either have to sell vehicles with internal combustible engines, ICE engines, based upon what consumers want, or and if they do so, they pay a hefty fine to the federal government for building ICE vehicles, or they can spend massive amounts of money for EVs that that a few people want. And then just lose money that way. So they're in a no-win situation. All right, so the CAFE standard, that was set in 2015, 35 miles per gallon. That appears to be the sweet spot. I somewhat disagree with that, but I'll go for it for the sake of this argument. The EPA should at least return to the 2015 standards, CAFE standards, setting the mileage at 35 miles per gallon per vehicle. That was, at least the Federalist argues, the sweet spot where you kind of got the best of both worlds. You didn't have to get rid of ICE engines. You just made them more energy, if you will, or fuel efficient. And we were doing fine. But again, this is all about control. China, getting back to China. China is not a competitor. They're a threat. This is an issue that we have to address. China has taken steps to become dominant in the auto market in Asia, Latin America, and Europe as well. Even the CEO of Ford said that China is an existential threat, and their Chinese EV makers are an existential threat to the U.S. auto industry, he says. And by the way, did you guys know that China profits from the Paris Climate Accords? Did you know that? Because they're still considered a developing nation, so they even manipulate people involved in the climate accord because they get $300 billion from these nations that are dumb enough to participate in the Paris Climate Accords. So all these nations participate in the Paris Climate Accord. China gets $300 billion from each of these nations. Since they're a developing nation, they subsidize their car market and artificially lower the prices of cars, and it makes it impossible for America and our allies to compete against China. You talk about suicide. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. So here's what Congress could do, however. They could make it a crime for any U.S. company or individual to share their... Oh, that's another thing. They make sure that if any vehicle comes, is sent into China, we have to give up intellectual property rights so that they can steal our research and development. Are you kidding me? So Congress needs to get hip to this. They have to make it a crime for any U.S. company or individual to share those intellectual property rights with China. They also, similarly, any foreign entity working with an American company that shares its intellectual property with China should face fines or a fine, or a ban from doing business in the U.S. Congress, lastly, should also pass a ban on Chinese-sourced and manufactured EVs. This is how we got to, get hip to or defeat China on this front. Competitors also need to get hip to the same safety standards. Europe, Japan, and South Korea, they charge, if we're sending cars to Europe, there's a 10% tariff that we have to pay, whereas if Europe sends cars to us, it's a 2.5% tariff. Either we need to get rid of that tariff or there needs to be some reciprocity, all right? And then we need to set universal safety standards with our allies, whether that's Europe, Japan, every single one of them. This makes production go much faster. and it reduces costs for everyone. And every car buyer should know the environmental impact of EVs. And that way people will start moving away from those things. If you do that and drill, baby, drill, you can save America's auto industry and you can save the planet.